Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Shroud of Turin. Introduction. There is a piece of cloth, aged in amber in color, housed behind thick bulletproof glass in climate-controlled chapel in the city of Turin. It is roughly 14.5 feet long and a little under 4 feet wide. Its surface is lightly discolored in places, a faint, almost sepia-toned silhouette of a man, front and back, bearing what appears to be wounds, marks at the wrist, feet, and side, striations across the shoulders and back, consistent with flagellation, and a series of small puncture marks arranged around the crown of the head. The image is ghostly, barely perceptible in ordinary light, and yet it has captivated, divided, and obsessed scholars, scientists, theologians, forgers, pilgrims, and skeptics for nearly 7 centuries. This is the Shroud of Turin. It is, depending on whom you ask, either the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, the most important Christian relic in existence, or an extraordinary medieval forgery produced by an unknown artist whose techniques remain baffling to modern science. It is both of these things, and perhaps neither. What it undeniably is, however, is one of the most studied, tested, debated, and written about object in human history. It has been carbon dated, spectrally analyzed, photographed in infrared and ultraviolet, examined by forensic pathologists, botanists, textile historians, numismatists, palynologists, and theoretical physicists. It has been the subject of papal statements in academic conferences and late-night arguments in university common rooms. It has inspired devotion that brings grown adults to tears standing before it, and contempt sharp enough to fill whole books. In the hours ahead, we are going to move through the entire story of this cloth, slowly and with care. We will start with the cloth itself, its physical properties, its strange image, its wounds and bloodstains, and then travel backward in time, through the world that produced it, or that might have preserved it. We will spend time in 1st century Jerusalem, in the Roman world of public execution, in the Byzantine court of Constantinople, in medieval France, in the laboratories of Los Alamos, and in the present day, where the debate shows no sign of resolution. Settle in, breathe slowly, let the details come to you at their own pace. Chapter 1. The object itself. Before we can understand the controversy, we need to understand the thing at the center of it. The shroud is a single piece of linen cloth, hand-woven in a herringbone twill pattern, specifically a 3/1 weave, meaning that in the warp direction, each weft thread passes over 3 warp threads before going under one. This creates the subtle diagonal ribbing characteristic of herringbone twill. The weave pattern was known in medieval Europe, but was not common. It appears in certain luxury textile of the period. However, Some textile historians have argued that it is more consistent with weaving traditions of the ancient Near East, specifically the kind of fine linen produced in Syria, Egypt, and the Levant during the Roman period. A comparable weave has been identified in textiles from Roman-era Egypt, suggesting the technique was known and practiced in the ancient Mediterranean world. The cloth is large enough that, folded in half lengthwise, it could plausibly have wrapped a human body from head to toe, with the front and back images appearing at opposite ends of the cloth, head to head in the center, so that a body laid on one half of the cloth would be covered by the other half folding over it. This is precisely how the Gospels describe the burial wrapping of Jesus: the body laid on the cloth drawn up and over. The dimensions are consistent with this use. The linen itself has been analyzed in considerable detail. It is made from flax fiber, spun into yarn and woven. The flax appears to have been retted, which is a process of soaking harvested flax stalk in water to allow bacteria and fungi to break down the outer plant material and free the inner bast fibers. This process, which has been used since antiquity, leaves traces in the chemical composition of the fiber. Analysis of the shroud's linen has detected the presence of a thin coating on the outer fibers, a layer of starch saccharide compound, sometimes called the impurity layer or carbohydrate layer, which has attracted significant scientific interest because it may be relevant to how the image was formed. Raymond Rogers of Los Alamos argued in his 2005 paper that this coating, which he identified as a Saponaria officinalis extract used in the retting process and as a finishing agent, was present in different form in the sample area used for carbon dating, suggesting that area had been repaired or treated differently from the rest of the cloth. The image on the cloth is not painted, at least not in any conventional sense. No brush strokes have ever been identified under microscopic examination, despite the fact that a number of the world's most skilled microscopists have looked for them. The discoloration that forms the image exists only in the outermost fibril of the linen threads, the very surface layer penetrating to a depth estimated at roughly 200 nanometers. A nanometers is 1/billionth of a meter. To put that in perspective, a human hair is approximately 80,000 nanometers in diameter. The image sits on the surface of the shroud the way frost sits on a window pane, a phenomenon of extraordinary delicacy that has resisted every attempt at replication. Known pigments and dyes do not behave this way. They sink into fibers, they saturate, they penetrate. The shroud's image, by contrast, is confined to the very outermost layer of the outermost fibril, and nowhere else. The man whose image appears on the cloth is referred to by researchers, regardless of their conclusions about authenticity, simply as the man in the shroud. His physical characteristics have been extensively analyzed. He appears to be tall by ancient standards. Estimates range from 5 feet 7 inches to 6 feet, depending on the methodology used to interpret the image. He is lean and muscular. His hair appears long, parted in the middle, falling to his shoulders. His beard is forked. His face is elongated. There is a prominent nose, and what appear to be swollen cheekbones and damage around one eye. injuries consistent with blunt trauma. His hands are crossed over his pelvis, the left hand over the right. The wounds visible on the cloth are the features that has attracted the most forensic attention. On the wrists, not the palms, there are dark stains consistent with wounds from penetrating objects. On the feet, similar marks. On the lower back, a broad wound on the left side of the chest and across the back and shoulders. Striped markings consistent with marks left by a Roman flagrum, the whip used in Roman scourgings. These stripe marks are numerous, covering much of the back, buttocks, and upper legs. They appear in pairs, consistent with a flagrum whose thongs were tipped with paired lead or bone weights called plumbate. The marks are found at the angle consistent with a shorter person standing behind and above the victim, swinging a whip downward, or with the victim bent forward over a post, which is how Roman scourging was typically administered. Around the scalp and forehead, and continuing around the back of the head, are series of small puncture marks, not in a circular band as the crown of thorns is invariably depicted in religious art, but distributed across the entire head in a pattern more consistent with a cap or helmet of thorns, rather than a simple circular wreath. This distinction is important and will come up again. The chest wound on the left side has attracted particular attention from pathologists because the stains appears to show two distinct fluids, a darker reddish-brown area consistent with blood, and a lighter, more watery area. This has been interpreted as consistent with a postmortem wound to the chest that pierced either the pericardium, the sac around the heart, or the pleural cavity, causing both blood and clear fluid to flow. The Gospel of John specifically describes a soldier piercing the side of Jesus after death with a lance, and states that blood and water came out, a detail that early commentators struggle to explain theologically, but which pathologists reading John's account now interpret as consistent with exactly this kind of post-mortem chest wound. The bloodstain on the shroud have been studied extensively. They predate the image, a detail established by the STURP researchers who found that the blood areas resist image formation, as if the blood was on the cloth before the image was formed. This is consistent with a body bleeding onto the cloth before the image appeared, and is awkward for a simple painting hypothesis, in which one would expect the image to have been laid down first. Dr. Alan Adler, a porphyrin chemist at Western Connecticut State University, who devoted much of his career to shroud research, analyzed fibers from the blood-stained areas and identified the presence of porphyrins, the ring-shaped molecular structures that form the core of hemoglobin, along with bilirubin, albumin, and immunoglobulin. He noted that the bilirubin levels were elevated above what would be expected in normal blood, and proposed that this was consistent with a person who had experienced extreme physical trauma before death. In severe physical trauma, the destruction of red blood cells releases large quantities of bilirubin into the bloodstream. There are also on the cloth the physical records of historical disasters, scorch marks and water stains from the fire of 1532, symmetrically distributed across the cloth in the pattern created by the folded cloth's exposure to the heat of a burning silver reliquary. The triangular patches sewn over the burn holes by the Poor Clare nuns in 1534, and the full-length holland cloth backing that was attached to the shroud for support were removed in 2002 during a conservation project. This removal revealed for the first time in 5 centuries the full underside of the cloth. Some researchers found features on the underside that added to the image formation mystery, as we will discuss later. Others were dismayed that potentially irreplaceable historical evidence had been disturbed. The cloth has been examined by X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet photography, visible spectroscopy, electron microscopy, and Raman spectroscopy. Each technique has contributed details to the composite picture. Ultraviolet photography revealed the bloodstain margins with special clarity and shows that the bloodstain fluoresced differently from the surrounding cloth. X-ray fluorescence mapping shows an even distribution of calcium and iron across the cloth, consistent with natural soil and plant mineral content, rather than applied pigment. Infrared imaging reveals features of the weave and the fire damage that are visible in ordinary light. What we have in sum is a cloth of genuinely unusual character, unusual in its fiber structure, unusual in the nature of its image, unusual in the precision of the anatomical details of its wounds, and unusual in the physical chemistry of its bloodstains. Before we can understand what it might mean, we need to understand the world that it comes from. Chapter 2: Jerusalem, Golgotha, and the Passion Story. To understand what the shroud claims to record, we need to spend time in the world of first-century Jerusalem, in the specific historical and theological context of the events the shroud is said to bear witness. This means engaging with the Passion narrative as it is told in the 4th canonical Gospels, as well as with the historical and archaeological record of Roman crucifixion and Jewish burial customs. These are not merely background details. They are the framework within which every feature of the shroud's image has been analyzed and interpreted. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all contain accounts of the arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus, though they differ in detail in ways that have occupied biblical scholars for 2 millennia. For our purposes, the general arc is consistent across all 4 accounts. Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish teacher who had attracted a significant following in Galilee and Judea, arrived in Jerusalem during the Feast of Passover, the spring festival commemorating the Israelites' liberation from Egypt, which drew hundreds of thousands of Jewish pilgrims to the city. He was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, on the Mount of Olives, east of the city, on the night before Passover, following a meal with his disciples that became known in Christian tradition as the Last Supper. His arrest followed a betrayal by one of his followers, Judas Iscariot, who identified him to the arresting party with a kiss. He was brought first before the Jewish high priest Caiaphas, then before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Pilate, the Gospel agreed, found no basis for condemning Jesus under Roman law, but capitulated under pressure from the crowd and the religious authorities, who framed the accusations in terms that would concern any Roman governor. The claim that Jesus had called himself King of the Jews was seditious, and Pilate could not be seen to ignore it. The Gospel of John gives the most elaborate account of the exchange between Pilate and Jesus, in which Pilate repeatedly attempts to release Jesus, and Jesus responds with enigmatic statements about truth and about the nature of his kingdom. Before the crucifixion, the Gospels describe Jesus being subjected to flogging, Roman scourging, and to mockery by Roman soldiers who dressed him in a purple robe and placed the crown of thorns on his head. The flogging is described briefly in all four Gospels. The crown of thorns appear in Matthew, Mark, and John. The precise details of these abuses have been examined in the light of the shroud's markings, with considerable interest by forensic researchers. The shroud shows approximately 120 separate scourge marks, distributed across the back, buttocks, and upper thighs in the pattern consistent with a Roman flagrum. The distribution and angle of the marks suggest they were applied by two individuals standing on either side of the victim, which is consistent with descriptions of Roman scourging practice. Following the scourging and mockery, Jesus was made to carry the crossbar of his cross, the patibulum, through the streets of Jerusalem to the place of execution, a hill outside the city walls called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. The full Latin cross used in Roman crucifixion was typically left standing at the execution site. Condemned men were required to carry only the horizontal beam, which could weigh 30 to 40 kilograms. The Gospel of Luke records that a man named Simon of Cyrene was conscripted to help carry the cross when Jesus faltered, an indication that the preceding scourging had already significantly weakened him. Many researchers examining the shroud image have noted that the man's nose appeared damaged, his knees appear to show abrasion marks, and his shoulders show an abrasion or bruising, consistent with having carried a heavy wooden beam. The crucifixion itself is described with restraint in all four Gospels. The evangelists say simply that they crucified him and proceed to the surrounding events. The physical details are not elaborated, but the Gospels do record certain specific details that have been examined in the light of the shroud's markings. The nails through the hands or wrists are implied by the post-resurrection accounts of Thomas, demanding to see the nail marks. The titulus, there's inscription recording the charge, is mentioned in all four Gospels, though they record its wording slightly differently. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in John's account, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews, in Matthew, the King of the Jews in Mark, this is the King of the Jews in Luke. The titulus was typically nailed above the condemned person's head on the cross. The Gospels describe Jesus dying within approximately 6 hours of being crucified, usually quickly, since crucifixion was designed to be a slow death by exhaustion and suffocation. Death typically came over many hours or even days. John's Gospel records that the soldiers, intending to hasten death by breaking the legs of those crucified, found Jesus already dead and did not break his legs, but instead pierced the side with a lance, and immediately blood and water came out, John records. The burial is described across all four Gospels and involves several named figures. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Jewish council who was a secret disciple of Jesus, went to Pilate and obtained the body. He purchased linen cloth and wrapped the body in it, then placed it in a new tomb cut out of a rock, a tomb that belonged to Joseph himself. In the Gospel of John, Nicodemus, another secret disciple and member of the Sanhedrin, brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 Roman pounds worth, which was applied to the burial cloths. The body was laid in the tomb before sunset, because the next day was the Sabbath, when work, including the completion of burial preparations, was forbidden. The tomb was sealed with a large stone rolled across its entrance. On the first day of the week, the day Christians called Easter Sunday, Mary Magdalene and other women came to the tomb and found the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. The Gospel of John records that Peter and the beloved disciple ran to the tomb and found the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. This specific detail, the face cloth folded separately, has attracted considerable scholarly attention, both from those who read it as evidence for the resurrection and from those who see in it the starting point of the relic tradition. The Greek words used in the New Testament for burial cloth are important and have been the subject of extended linguistic debate. John uses orthonia in the plural, linen wrappings or bandages, which some scholars read as evidence that multiple strips of cloth were used in the Egyptian mummy wrapping style rather than a single large shroud. Luke uses the word sindon, a single large cloth, to describe what Joseph brought for the burial. The distinction between a multiple strip burial and a single shroud burial matters because the Shroud of Turin is emphatically a single large cloth, not strips. Proponents of the shroud note that different gospel authors may have been describing the same burial differently, or that multiple cloths could have been used alongside the main sindon. Critics argue that John's detailed account of finding the burial cloths, if referring to the shroud, would be impossible to reconcile with the single large cloth now in Turin. Jewish burial customs of the first century have been studied in considerable detail, both from historical sources and from archaeological evidence. At the time of Jesus, wealthy or well-connected Jews in the Jerusalem area were typically buried in rock-cut tombs with benches carved from the stone. The body was washed, anointed with aromatic oils and spices, and wrapped in linen. In some traditions, the face was covered with a separate cloth. The body was left in the tomb for approximately a year, after which the bones were collected and placed in a stone ossuary, a small box. This practice, primary burial followed by secondary ossuarial burial, was widespread in Jerusalem in the first century. The shroud, if genuine, would represent the primary burial wrapping used for the first stage of the interment. The specific details of the shroud's wounds have been evaluated against the historical and archaeological record of Roman crucifixion with considerable care. The most direct archaeological evidence for Roman crucifixion comes from a single remarkable find, the heel bone of a young man named Yehohanan, discovered in a tomb at Gavat HaMitar in Jerusalem in 1968. The bone had an iron nail driven through it, with fragments of olive wood and the end of the nail bent back by contact with a knot in the wood, evidence that the nail had been driven through the foot into the wood of the cross. This discovery confirmed that crucifixion victims were indeed nailed rather than tied, and gave crucifixion researchers a concrete datum point for the physical mechanics of the execution. The location of the nail wound in the wrist rather than the palms, one of the most discussed features of the shroud, has a basis in anatomy. The palm of the hands, as Pierre Barbet demonstrated in his experiment with cadavers in the 1930s and 1940s, do not have a stable structure capable of supporting the weight of a human body hung on a cross. The tissue between the metacarpal bones would tear and the body would fall. The wrist, by contrast, has the bones of the carpus, 8 small bones arranged in 2 rows, which can support the body's weight without tearing. Barbet identified what he called distaut space, a natural gap between the carpal bones through which a nail could be driven without breaking bone, and which would emerge at the correct location to match the shroud's wrist wound. Medieval artists working from theological tradition rather than anatomical knowledge universally depicted the nail wound in the palms. Chapter 3. The Early Christian World. To understand why an object like the shroud would exist, why someone would preserve it, venerate it, fight over it, and die for it, we need to understand the culture of sacred relics in early Christianity. This culture is not incidental background. It is the entire context within which the shroud's existence and preservation make sense, whether as a genuine ancient relic or as a medieval construction designed to tap into that tradition. Christianity emerged from Judaism in the 1st century CE, but it did so in the context of a broader Greco-Roman world which had its own traditions of sacred objects, divine images, and veneration of the dead. The Romans kept images of their ancestors and venerated them as household gods. They preserved the bones and ashes of the honored dead. They attributed miraculous powers to the images of deities and to objects that had been in contact with the divine. This cultural landscape shaped the form that Christians' devotions took as the faith spread across the Roman Empire. The earliest Christian veneration of physical objects focused on martyrs, those who had died for their faith during the Roman persecutions of the first 3 centuries. The bones of martyrs were preserved beneath altars. The faithful sought physical contact with them. Churches were built over the tombs of apostles and saints. This was not accidental. The theological logic was rooted in the incarnation, the central Christian claim that God had become human, had taken on flesh, and had therefore sanctified matter itself. If the body of Christ was holy, then bodies that bore witness to Christ were holy too. Veneration of relics was not worship of the material object. It was participation in the sanctifying power that had passed through it. The transformation of Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into the favored religion of the Roman Empire, accomplished by the Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE, and his subsequent patronage of the Church, dramatically accelerated the culture of relics. Constantine's mother, Helena, whom the Church later venerated as a saint, made a celebrated pilgrimage to the Holy Land around 326 CE. The accounts of her journey describe her discovering the true cross beneath a pagan temple in Jerusalem, the Temple of Venus that the Emperor Hadrian had built over the site of the crucifixion in the 2nd century. Helena allegedly identified the true cross by a miracle. a sick woman was brought to touch the 3 crosses found at the site, and recovered only when she touched the one Helena designated as authentic. Helena distributed fragments of the cross to churches throughout the empire. She also claimed to find other relics, the nails from the crucifixion, which Constantine reportedly had worked into his helmet and his horse's bridle. The historical accuracy of Helena's discovery is impossible to verify. What is beyond dispute is their cultural impact. The idea that physical objects associated with the life and death of Jesus had been preserved and could be found, held, and venerated. This idea electrified the Christian world. Within decades, Jerusalem had become the most important pilgrimage destination in the Christian world, and pilgrims returned from the Holy Land bearing fragments of the cross, water from the Jordan, oil from lamps burning over holy tombs, and soil from sacred sites. The relic market expanded to meet the demand. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the range of relics venerated in the Christian world had expanded to include items that strained credulity even at the time. The satirical writer Erasmus, writing in the 16th century, mocked the fact that there were enough pieces of the true cross distributed across Europe to build a fleet of ships, a criticism that had already been made in the 4th century by Cyril of Jerusalem, who felt compelled to defend the authenticity of the true cross despite the proliferation of fragments. By the medieval period, European churches claimed possession of the following items, among many others: the crown of thorns or fragments of it, several of the nails from the crucifixion, the holy lance that pierced Christ's side, the holy prepuce, Jesus' foreskin allegedly preserved from the circumcision performed on the 8th day after his birth, and claimed by at least a dozen different churches, the bones of the Magi who visited the infant Jesus, vials of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, locks of her hair, her wedding ring, and the table from the Last Supper. We relate this not to mock the medieval faithful, but to understand the world the shroud entered when it surfaced in Lyre. It entered a world in which the veneration of physical objects associated with Christ and the saints was not merely tolerated, but enthusiastically encouraged by the Church, in which pilgrimage to such objects was a major cultural and economic phenomenon, and in which the appetite for relics of the Passion, the instruments and witnesses of Christ's suffering, was particularly intense. In this context, a cloth bearing the image of a crucified man was not just a curiosity, it was potentially the most important object in Christendom. The specific biblical references to burial cloths that we discussed in the previous chapter were well known to medieval Christians. They meant that a candidate burial shroud would arrive into the world already theologically primed to receive it, already possessing a scriptural framework within which it would be understood. Whether that priming reflects the actual preservation of the original burial cloth, or whether it means that someone in the medieval period understood exactly which gap in the relic landscape they were filling when they produced the shroud, is precisely the question that divides the two camps. Chapter 4: Edessa, the Mandylion, and the Long Shadow of Early History. Before we reach the medieval emergence of the shroud, we need to examine a theory that has, for some researchers, bridged the gap between the 1st century and 14th century France. This theory involves another relic, one with its own deep, entangled history, called the image of Edessa, or the Mandylion. The city of Edessa, now known as Sanlarfa, in southeastern Turkey, was one of the earliest centers of Eastern Christianity. It sat at the crossroads of trade routes between the Mediterranean world and Mesopotamia, and its conversion to Christianity, if the traditions are to be believed, predated even the legalization of the faith under Constantine. The city's first-century ruler was Abgar V Ukama, known as Abgar the Black, who reigned from approximately 4 BCE to 7 CE, and then again from 13 to 50 CE. It is around this king that one of the most important relic legends in Christian history is woven. The story, preserved in its earliest form in the church history written by Eusebius of Caesarea around 313 CE, runs as follows. Abgar, suffering from a terrible illness. Some traditions say it was gout, others say leprosy. Heard of the healings Jesus was performing in Judea, and sent a messenger named Ananias to find him. Ananias carried a letter from Abgar inviting Jesus to come to Edessa and heal him, with the king offering Jesus refuge from the enemies who sought to destroy him in Judea. Jesus was unable to come, Eusebius records, because he had work to complete that he had been sent to do, but he wrote back through Ananias, promising to send a disciple after his ascension who would heal Abgar and bring salvation to his city. This exchange of letters, which Eusebius claimed to have copied from the royal archives of Edessa, is known as the Abgar correspondence. So far, so remarkable, but the story grows. Later versions of the legend, developing through the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, added a detail that was not in Eusebius's account, that Ananias was not only a letter carrier, but a painter, who had been commissioned by Abgar to bring back a portrait of Jesus. When Ananias arrived in Judea, the crowds around Jesus were so thick that he could not get close enough to paint him. Jesus, aware of Ananias's purpose, called him forward, asked for water in a cloth, washed his face, and dried it in the cloth. And on the cloth appeared a miraculous image of his face, formed without any human agency. This cloth, the octeropoieton, the image not made by human hands, was the gift Jesus sent back to Abgar. When Abgar received it and pressed it to his face, he was healed. This cloth became the Palladium of Edessa, its sacred protector, believed to guarantee the city against conquest. According to the tradition, the Mandylion, from the Arabic mandal, meaning cloth or veil, was concealed in a niche above one of the city gates, hidden there during a period of pagan reaction under one of Abgar's successors, and forgotten. It was rediscovered in the 6th century during the renovation work on the city walls. The story of the discovery having been conveniently preserved in a document that was found alongside it. The timing of the discovery, around 544 CE, coincided with a devastating Persian siege of Edessa under Khusro I. According to the Chronicle, the bishop of Edessa carried the Mandylion in procession around the city walls, and the Persian forces were repulsed by a miraculous fire. Edessa was saved. After this, the Mandylion became one of the most venerated objects in Eastern Christianity. Contemporary descriptions recorded in the 6th and 7th centuries describe a cloth folded or mounted in a frame called the tetradeplin, meaning double in four, bearing the face of Christ, formed without human artistry. The cloth was housed in a cathedral of Edessa until 944 CE, when the Byzantine Emperor Romanos I Lecapenus sent a military expedition to Edessa and negotiated one of the most extraordinary diplomatic transactions in medieval history. He offered the emir of Edessa the release of 200 Muslim prisoners and a guarantee of safety from Byzantine attack in exchange for the mandilion. After considerable negotiations and some dispute about whether the cloth being surrendered was the authentic one, the Edessan reportedly tried to substitute a copy. The mandilion was brought to Constantinople with enormous ceremony. The account of the translation, the formal transfer of the relic, describes crowds lining the roads for miles, church bells ringing across the city, and the emperor himself carrying the cloth in procession. In Constantinople, the mandilion was installed in the pharaoh's chapel of the imperial palace, the most important private chapel of the Byzantine Empire, which already housed what was believed to be the largest collection of passion relics in the world, including the crown of thorns, the true cross, the nails, and the lance. It remained there for 260 years, until the Fourth Crusade and the catastrophic sack of Constantinople in 1204. Now here is where Ian Wilson's theory becomes genuinely interesting. Wilson, in his 1978 book, The Turin Shroud, proposed that the mandilion and the Shroud of Turin are the same object. His argument is layered and intricate. The key observation is this: the shroud is folded along its length twice and then along its width twice more, creating a rectangle 8-layer thick with only the face visible through an opening in the folded layer, would produce precisely the kind of object described in early accounts of the mandilion: a cloth folded 4 ways, showing only the face of Christ. The full body image would be hidden within the folds. Anyone who knew what the full cloth looked like would have kept the information secret. Anyone examining the relic in its framed, folded state would see only a face. This accounts for why all early descriptions of the mandilion describe only a facial image. If Wilson is right, no one in Edessa knew there was more. Wilson bolstered his argument with an analysis of Byzantine iconography. Before the 6th century, images of Christ in Byzantine art show considerable variation in facial type. There is no settled canonical representation. After the 6th century, and specifically after the mandilion becomes prominent in Eastern Christian tradition, a distinct facial type emerges: long hair parted in the middle, a forked beard, prominent nose, and asymmetrical features. This type becomes the standard representation of Christ in Byzantine art for the next 1,000 years. Wilson argues that this standardization reflected Byzantine artists working from the mandilion as their model, and that the features of this standardized Christ image match those of the man in the shroud. The critics of Wilson's theory have raised several objections. First, no contemporary description of the mandilion in Edessa or Constantinople explicitly describes it as a full-body image or even hints at a hidden full-body image. The accounts consistently describe it as a face on a small cloth. If the full shroud were hidden within a frame, someone would eventually have opened the frame or noticed the additional bulk of the fabric. Second, a tetradeplin fold of the shroud would produce a cloth 8 layers thick, with the face image deeply buried within, not easily visible from above. Third, the transfer documents from 944 CE describe the mandilion in terms that suggest it was a relatively modest cloth, not a 14-foot linen sheet, even when folded. Fourth, accounts of what survived the sack of Constantinople in 1204 do not clearly mention a full-length burial shroud among the treasures of the pharaoh's chapel. These are serious objections, and Wilson acknowledged them. His theory remains a hypothesis rather than an established fact, but it has two things going for it that keep it alive in the scholarly literature. It is internally consistent, and it would explain the most frustrating feature of the shroud's history, the apparent absence of any documented trace before the 1350s. There is one more piece of the pre-medieval puzzle that deserves careful attention: the Hungarian Prayer Codex. This is an illuminated manuscript produced in Hungary between 1192 and 1195, the oldest surviving document written in Hungarian, which contains a series of illustrations of the Passion and Burial of Christ. Two of these illustrations are remarkable. The first shows Christ's body being prepared for burial on a flat surface. The body is naked, the arms are crossed precisely as they appear on the shroud. The fingers of the visible hand appear to merge together as they do in the shroud image, an anomaly that has been noticed by researchers. And the cloth beneath the body appears to show a distinct pattern of herringbone weave. The second illustration, showing the angels at the empty tomb, with a folded cloth beside them, shows a rectangular cloth with a row of 4 small holes arranged in an L shape, holes that precisely match the arrangement of a set of pre-1532 burn holes on the shroud, burn holes that were caused by an incident predating the 1532 fire, and which are not mentioned in any known historical document before the shroud was photographed in 1898. If the Hungarian artist was drawing from the shroud, then the shroud was in Hungary in the late 12th century, well before the carbon dating range of 1260 to 1390 CE. The Prayer Codex evidence is taken seriously by a number of serious scholars. The matching of the burnhole pattern is particularly difficult to dismiss as a coincidence. Critics argue that the similarities could be coincidental, that the herringbone pattern is visible in other period art, and that the merged fingers could reflect artistic convention. The debate continues. Chapter 5. The Medieval Emergence. Whatever may or may not have happened in earlier centuries, the Shroud of Turin enters history with documentary specificity in the 1350s. In the small French town of Livre, in the Champagne region southeast of Paris. Understanding this emergence requires understanding the world of medieval France, the culture of knighthood, pilgrimage, and ecclesiastical politics within which the shroud first became a documented object. The man at the center of the story is Geoffrey I de Charny, and he deserves more than a passing mention. De Charny was born around 1300 into a noble family of the Champagne region. He served the French crown faithfully through some of the most turbulent decades of the 100 Years' War, the long, grinding conflict between France and England that defined the 14th and 15th century. He fought at the Siege of Morlaix in 1341, participated in campaigns in Gascony and Brittany, and in 1347 attempted to recapture Calais from the English by bribing its English commanders. The plan failed when Edward III of England discovered the scheme. Descharny was captured and ransomed. He later ransomed again at an enormous cost after being taken prisoner at a tournament in 1354. Descharny's intellectual and spiritual life was as distinguished as his military career. He wrote 3 treatises on chivalry: Le Livre de Chevalerie, Le Livre Charny, Demande pour la Joute. They are considered among the most important surviving documents on the theory and practice of medieval knighthood. He saw the life of the knight as a form of Christian vocation, a path to spiritual as well as earthly honor. This context matters. Descharny was not merely a political operator who acquired a valuable relic for commercial purposes. He was a man of deep piety who had founded the collegiate church at Lorey, a church with a chapter of canons whose prayers would perpetually intercede for his soul and the souls of his family. The shroud, whatever it was central to his spiritual program. How Descharny came to possess the shroud is entirely unknown. He never explained it in any surviving document. This silence has been interpreted in opposite ways, as evidence that the provenance was too sensitive to reveal. Perhaps he had obtained it through questionable means from a Templar estate, perhaps, or from the aftermath of a crusade, or as evidence that there was nothing to explain, because it was a recently commissioned object. The truth is simply that we do not know, and the silence of the historical record is frustrating rather than informative. The display at Lorey, sometimes around 1354, drew immediate crowds of pilgrims as noted. A commemorative badge in lead tin alloy, the standard material for medieval pilgrimage souvenirs, was produced for visitors. These badges were typically cast from molds, sold by the thousand, and pinned to pilgrims' hats or cloaks as evidence of their pilgrimage. The Lirey badge, a single example of which was found in the mud of the Seine riverbank in Paris in 1855, shows a cloth with a double image of a man, front and back, displayed between 2 shields bearing the coat of arms of the Descharny and de Vergy families. The proportions and appearance of the displayed cloth match the Shroud of Turin precisely. This is the oldest known physical artifact documenting the shroud's existence, and it places the shroud in Lorey in the mid-14th century beyond any doubt. The bishop's intervention deserves more attention than it typically receives. Henry of Poitiers, Bishop of Troyes from 1354 to 1370, was not a credulous or easily swayed man. He was a canon lawyer and a theologian who had served as an official of the French crown before his episcopal appointment. When reports of the Lorey display reached him, he launched what appeared to have been a genuine investigation, interviewing witnesses, examining the cloth, and consulting with artists. His conclusion, recorded in the subsequent memorandum of Pierre Darcy, was not that the cloth was probably a forgery or that it was suspicious, but that he had found the artist who made it. This unnamed artist reportedly confessed to having painted the cloth by a skill and subtlety. If true, this would be definitive, but the artist is never named in any surviving document. The investigation's record have not survived, and the claim of a named confession exists only in Pierre Darcy's second-hand account, written 35 years after the fact. The Pierre Darcy Memorandum, written in 1389, is the most important document in the Shroud's early medieval history, and it rewards careful reading. Darcy was writing to Pope Clement VII in urgent and somewhat alarmed terms, because Geoffrey II de Charny, son of the original Geoffrey, had resumed the Shroud's public display in Lorraine. Darcy had tried to stop the display through local church authority and had been rebuffed. He was going over the local hierarchy's head, directly to the Pope. His memorandum describes the crowd, the indulgences offered, and the financial benefits accruing to the church and canons of Lorraine. It then recounts the earlier investigation by Henry of Poitiers and the claimed discovery of the artist. Darcy uses strong language. The cloth was, quote, falsely and deceitfully fabricated, unquote. People were being, quote, deceived and deluded, unquote. The exhibition was conducted, quote, for the purpose of gain, unquote. He clearly wanted the display stopped and the cloth condemned. Clement VII's response was curiously equivocal. He did not condemn the shroud. He issued a formal ruling in January 1390, permitting the display to continue, subject to a declaration at each display that it was a, quote, figure or representation of the true shroud, unquote. He also imposed a strict silence on Darcy. The bishop was ordered, under pain of excommunication, not to speak further against the shroud. The silencing of Darcy has struck many historians as significant. If Clement simply believed Darcy was correct, the natural response would have been to condemn the cloth and end the controversy. Instead, he permitted the display while requiring a disclaimer, a compromise that satisfied no one, but managed to contain the controversy. In 1418, as the Hundred Years' War created increasing instability in northern France, the canons of Lorraine entrusted the shroud to Humbert de la Roche, Lord of Lorraine, for safekeeping. He held it at various locations until his death, after which his widow, Margaret de Charny, granddaughter of Geoffrey I de Charny, maintained control of the cloth. Margaret exhibited the shroud on several occasions in the 1440s and 1450s to the repeated objections of the Lorraine chapter, which wanted it returned. In 1453, he transferred it to Duke Louis I of Savoy in exchange for a castle at Varamban and revenues from another castle. The Lorraine chapter protested to Rome for decades afterward without success. The shroud had left France. The House of Savoy was among the most important noble dynasties in late medieval Europe, ruling a territory that straddled the Alps between France and Italy, and served as a pivotal power in the complex politics of the Italian peninsula and the Holy Roman Empire. The Savoys were wealthy, politically sophisticated, and deeply pious. They would become the patrons of numerous religious foundations and would eventually, in the 19th century, become the kings of unified Italy. For them, the acquisition of what was claimed to be the burial shroud of Christ was not merely a religious act. It was a statement of dynastic prestige. The most sacred relic in Christendom was now in Savoyard hands. Under Savoy custody, the shroud was installed in a series of chapels and moved as the court traveled. It was displayed on multiple occasions to the faithful. In 1502, it was deposited in the Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry, the Savoyard capital, where it resided in an ornate silver reliquary. The reliquary, which was not survived, was described in contemporary accounts as a magnificent work of medieval goldsmithing. It was in this reliquary, in this chapel, that the shroud nearly ceased to exist entirely. On the night of December 3rd to 4th, 1532, a fire broke out in the sacristy of Saint Chapelle. The origin of the fire is unknown. The shroud's reliquary was of silver, stored in a locked iron grille within the sacristy, and by the time the fire was detected, the heat in the sacristy had become intense. Attempts to open the grille with keys failed. The heat had apparently warped the lock mechanism. A blacksmith was reportedly brought to force the grille open. By the time the reliquary was extracted and water was poured over it to cool it, the silver had partially melted. The interior of the folded shroud had been touched by drops of molten silver that burned through multiple layers of the folded cloth. The burn holes, when the shroud was unfolded, appeared in a symmetrical pattern along its length, 4 sets of holes corresponding to the folded layers. The water stains left by the cooling efforts were also visible across much of the cloth. In 1534, 2 years after the fire, Poor Clare nuns at the convent in Chambry undertook repairs. They cut 30 triangular patches of linen and sewed them over the burn holes, and they attached a full-length backing cloth, the Holland cloth, to the underside of the shroud for support. These repairs remained in place for 468 years, until the 2002 conservation project, and they significantly complicated the scientific examination of the cloth by obscuring portions of the underside and by adding new materials to the cloth's margins. In 1578, the shroud was moved from Chambry to Turin, then the capital of the expanding Savoyard state, in an act that combined practical politics with religious devotion. The aged Cardinal Archbishop of Milan, Carlo Borromeo, later canonized as St. Charles Borromeo, had made a vow to venerate the shroud on foot, walking across the Alps from Milan to Chambry. Duke Emmanuel Philibert of Savoy, reportedly moved by the cardinal's age and devotion, ordered the shroud brought to Turin to spare him the journey. Whether this story is entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, the practical result was that the shroud arrived in Turin, the political center of Savoyard power, and stayed. In 1694, it was placed in the Cappella della Sindon, the chapel of the shroud, built by the Baroque architect Guarino Guarini, specifically to house it as part of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. The Cappella della Sindone is itself a masterpiece of 17th century architecture, a soaring dome of interlocking arches in dark marble that creates a brooding, contemplative space appropriate to its contents. Guarini's design was innovative and influential. The chapel is considered one of the great monuments of Baroque religious architecture. It was severely damaged by fire in April 1997, a fire coincidentally similar in character to the 1532 fire, which again endangered the shroud, which was again rescued from a burning space by emergency workers who broke through bulletproof glass with a sledgehammer. The chapel's restoration has taken decades. The shroud itself moved to a safer location within the cathedral after the 1997 fire. Now rests in a specially designed display case filled with argon gas and maintained at controlled humidity and temperature. Chapter 6. The Photograph That Changed Everything. For the first 5.5 centuries of documented existence, the Shroud of Turin was understood primarily as a religious object. It was venerated, disputed, and politically significant, but it was never submitted to systematic examination of any kind. The possibility of such examination did not exist. That changed in 1898, in a way that no one anticipated. The occasion was a public exposition, one of the rare events when the cloth was displayed to the public. An occasion that drew pilgrims by the hundreds of thousands. King Umberto I of Italy authorized the display to coincide with celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the Italian Constitution. The shroud had been under the custody of the House of Savoy, now the royal family of unified Italy, and the exposition was a carefully managed event combining religious devotion with royal display. An amateur photographer and lawyer named Secondo Pia was given permission to photograph the cloth, one of the earliest uses of photography to document a religious object of significance. Photography was then approximately 60 years old as a technology. The equipment required for photographing large objects in dim conditions was cumbersome. Large glass plates coated with light-sensitive emulsions, long exposures, and careful darkroom work to develop the results. Pia set up his equipment on the evening of May 28, 1898, and made 2 exposures of the full shroud lit by electric arc lamps, also a novelty since electric lighting was only then becoming available in Italian cities. When Pia developed his glass plate negatives in his darkroom that night, he had one of the most startling experiences in the history of photography. In photographic negatives, as every photographer of the era understood, the tones of the subjects are reversed. Dark areas in the subject appear light in the negative, and light areas appear dark. When Pia looked at his negative, he expected to see a pale ghost of the shroud's already faint image, even more washed out and reversed. Instead, he saw the reverse of what he expected. The figure in the negative was not washed out but clear, detailed, and richly modeled, not like a negative at all, but like a positive portrait. The reason was that the image on the shroud was itself already a negative. When a negative is made of a negative, the result is effectively a positive. The shroud's image, which appeared to the naked eye as a faint, ghostly, rather flat impression, revealed under photographic reversal a fully realized 3-dimensional, luminously detailed face. Pia reportedly nearly dropped the plate in shock. He later wrote that the experience was one of profound spiritual emotion, and that he spent the remainder of the night in a state of contemplation. He recognized immediately that what he was looking at was not merely a photograph of a painting, but something far stranger, an image that had been encoded, as if by design, so that its full information was only revealed when the tones were reversed. A medieval forger, supposedly painting the image sometimes in the 13th or 14th century, would have had to produce a perfect photographic negative, centuries before photography was invented, for an effect that could not be appreciated until a camera made it visible. No one looking at the shroud with the naked eye for 5 centuries had appreciated the negative character of the image. To paint in negative for an effect invisible to the naked eye for 5 centuries would require either a photographer's understanding of tonal reversal, which did not exist in the 14th century, or an entirely different kind of image formation process. Pia's photographs were not immediately accepted without controversy. Some critics, in the atmosphere of heightened skepticism that greeted all shroud claims, argued that he had made errors in development, or had reversed his plates, or had in some other ways manipulated the result. The accusations were not accompanied by any specific technical analysis. They appeared to reflect a general reluctance to accept a result that seemed too convenient. A second authoritative set of photographs was made in 1931 by the professional photographer Giuseppe Henri, who used the most advanced photographic equipment then available and worked under careful supervision. Henri's photographs were technically superior to Pia's and confirmed the result with complete clarity. The face that emerged from the photographic negative was striking in its serenity and detail. Closed eyes, a long and straight nose, a forked beard, high and prominent cheekbones, and an expression of profound, almost unnerving calm. The detail of the face, including what appeared to be individual hairs of the beard, modeling of the facial muscles, and the suggestion of eyelashes, was not visible in the original cloth to the naked eye, but became clear in the negative photograph. In 1931, photographs printed in newspapers and religious publications across the world made the shroud a global topic for the first time. They inspired a new generation of medical and scientific attention to the image, and they established the emotional register of the modern shroud debate. The experience of looking at that face in the negative photograph was, for many people, impossible to dismiss as the product of medieval craftsmanship. It looked too much like a real person. It looked, in a word, like a photograph taken centuries before photography existed. One of the most important early respondents to the photographic revelation was Pierre Barbet, a French surgeon who served as chief surgeon at the St. Joseph Hospital in Paris. Barbet was a devout Catholic and a religious scientist, and he brought both commitments to his examination of the 1931 Henri photographs and later to his study of the actual cloth. His major work, A Doctor at Cavalry, published in 1950 and translated into English in 1953, remains one of the most thoroughly medical analyses of the shroud ever undertaken. Barbet conducted experiments with cadavers and amputated limbs. Ethically unremarkable in the mid-20th century, though striking to modern sensibilities, to test the mechanics of crucifixion and to determine whether the shroud's wounds were anatomically consistent with the method of execution described in the Gospels. Barbet's most celebrated finding concerned the location of the nail wounds. He demonstrated that nails driven through the palm of the hands, as depicted in virtually all medieval religious art, would tear free under the weight of the hanging body. The tissue between the metacarpal bones is not sufficiently robust, as we have discussed. Driving nails through cadaver hands and hanging weights objects from them, he consistently found tearing. When he instead drove nails through the wrist, specifically through a gap in the carpal bones that he identified as distraught space, the structure held. The nail passed cleanly between the carpal bones without breaking them, emerging at the correct locations to match the shroud's wound marks. Furthermore, Barbet found that a nail through distraught space necessarily contacted or compressed the median nerve, causing the thumb to reflectively fold onto the palm. This would explain why the shroud's figure's thumbs are not visible in the hand image. The thumbs are folded away, invisible. Barbet argued that no medieval forger working from artistic tradition would have placed the nail wounds in the wrist or included the detail of the retracted thumb. Both details were beyond the iconographic knowledge of the period. Chapter 7. Stirp, 5 days in Turin. The modern scientific era of shroud research began in earnest on October 1978, during another rare public exposition authorized by Cardinal Anastasio Ballestero, Archbishop of Turin. A multidisciplinary team of American scientists had spent several years negotiating access to the cloth for direct physical examination, and their request was finally granted. The team, formally called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, was composed of approximately 30 scientists from a range of institutions, most of them American, most of them from the national laboratories and research universities that represented the cutting edge of applied science in the late Cold War era. The team included physicists, chemists, biologists, forensic experts, photographers, and image analysis specialists. It included believers and skeptics, practicing Catholics and secular scientists. The political and logistical challenge of assembling 30 scientists, transporting 8 tons of equipment to Turin, and obtaining unprecedented access to one of the most jealously guarded objects in the world was considerable, and credit for navigating it belongs in large part to Fathers Adam Ottenbein and Peter Rinaldi, American priests who had long-standing relationship with the Turin church authorities, and to the STURP team's leaders, particularly the physicist John Jackson and the aerodynamicist Eric Jumper. The team worked in 5 consecutive days and nights in October 1978, conducting examinations while the cloth lay horizontally on a specially designed table in the palace of the Archbishop of Turin. The examination was relentless. The scientists worked in shifts through the nights, maximizing their limited access. They took X-ray photographs of the full cloth, UV and infrared photographs, visible light spectroscopy across the entire surface, X-ray fluorescence maps of elemental compositions, and hundreds of sticky tape samples. The sticky tape sample, pressing small pieces of adhesive tape against the cloth surface, peeling them away carrying surface fibers and debris, was conducted systematically across image areas, non-image areas, and blood-stained areas, creating a collection of microscope slides that would be analyzed by various team members for years afterwards. John Jackson's contribution to STURP deserves particular attention. Jackson, then a physicist at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory in Albuquerque, had been interested in the shroud since 1972 and had spent years analyzing the 1931 photographs with his colleague Eric Jumper before the 1978 access was granted. His most important pre-STURP findings involved a device called the VP8 image analyzer, which had been developed for NASA to convert the brightness values of space telescope images into topographic maps. The brighter the pixel, the higher the value, the more elevated the feature in the 3-dimensional output. Jackson and Jumper fed photographs of the shroud image into the VP8 and found something remarkable. Unlike ordinary photographs, which produce distorted and incoherent 3-dimensional outputs, in the VP8, because of the brightness of a flat photograph does not encode actual depth information, the shroud image produced a coherent 3-dimensional representation, a face and body with proper anatomical depth, the nose prominent, the forehead receding, the cloth body distance apparently encoded in the image's brightness at every point. Jackson interpreted this as evidence that the brightness of the shroud image at any given point reflected the distance between the cloth and the underlying body. The image was formed in some way in proportion to distance. This property, called image directionality by some researchers, has no parallel in known artistic techniques and has not been replicated by any proposed forgery method. The STRP team's published conclusions, summarized in a paper by Jumper, Jackson, and colleagues in 1984, and in numerous individual papers over the following years, were carefully stated but significant. On the image, it was not produced by any known pigment, dye, stain, powder, or chemical applied to the cloth. Microscopic examination found no evidence of the capillary wicking that would be expected if any liquid medium had been applied. There was no binding medium in the image areas. The image was formed by some process that altered the chemistry of the surface fibers. Specifically, some process that oxidized and dehydrated the cellulose in the outermost fibril, producing the yellow-brown discoloration we see. The image formation mechanism was, in the team's considered judgment, unknown. On the bloodstains, they were identified as blood by multiple chemical tests, including tests for porphyrin, albumin, bilirubin, and protein patterns consistent with whole blood. The blood appeared to predate the image. The most controversial figure within the STRP team was Walter McCrone. McCrone was a renowned microscopist, founder of the McCrone Research Institute in Chicago, and one of the most respected practitioners of his craft in the world. He had famously exposed several celebrated forgeries using microscopic analysis, including the Vinland map, a medieval map that was once thought to show pre-Columbian Norse knowledge of North America. McCrone analyzed the STRP sticky tape samples using polarized light microscopy and concluded that the tape samples from image areas contained iron oxide particles. Specifically, the red iron oxide known as red ochre, which is the basis of many red and brown pigments used in medieval paintings, along with traces of a protein binder consistent with tempera paint. He published his findings and declared the shroud a medieval painting, maintaining this conclusion with complete confidence until his death in 2002. The rebuttal from Heller and Adler was methodical and, to many researchers, persuasive. They argued that iron oxide is universally distributed across the entire cloth, in image areas, non-image areas, and blood areas alike, and that this distribution pattern is consistent with iron naturally present in the soil and in the flax plant themselves, not with applied pigment. Iron is taken up by flax from the soil during growth. It is a natural component of linen. The quantity of iron oxide they found was insufficient to account for the image's visibility and was not concentrated in the image areas as it would be if it were applied pigment. More importantly, Heller and Adler's chemical analysis of the protein binders that McCrone had identified showed that it was not consistent with tempera paint, but was consistent with blood serum. The protein in the blood area was blood protein. It was not painting medium. McCrone and Heller Adler were looking at the same samples through different analytical lenses. McCrone's microscopy found the presence of particles that looked like paint components. Heller and Adler's chemistry found that those particles could not produce the observed image, and that the protein was of biological rather than artistic origin. The disagreement was never resolved, because the two sides were effectively asking different questions of the same evidence. Chapter 8. The Carbon Dating Controversy. In 1988, radiocarbon dating one of the most reliable and widely used scientific dating techniques in existence, was applied to the shroud, and it produced a result that seemed definitive. The cloth dated to the medieval period, specifically between 1260 and 1390 CE, placing it firmly in the era of its documented historical emergence. The story of how that result was obtained, challenged, and remained contested nearly 4 decades later is one of the most instructive episodes in the history of forensic science. The principle of radiocarbon dating was established by the American chemist Willard Libby in the late 1940s. Libby recognized that living organisms continuously absorb carbon from the atmosphere in its natural isotopic distribution, mostly carbon-12, a stable isotope, but also a small proportion of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope created in the upper atmosphere by the collision of cosmic rays with nitrogen atoms. While an organism is alive, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in its tissues mirrors the ratio in the atmosphere. When it dies, it stops absorbing new carbon, and the carbon-14 it contains begins to decay at a fixed and well-known rate, with a half-life of approximately 5,730 years. By measuring the ratio of remaining carbon-14 to carbon-12 in a dead organic sample, scientists can calculate how long it has been since the organism died. Libby won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for this discovery in 1960. Since then, radiocarbon dating has been refined, extended, and validated thousands of times against objects of known age. It is a technique of extraordinary reliability within its applicable range. The application of radiocarbon dating to the shroud has been proposed since the 1970s, but was repeatedly deferred due to the large sample size required by older techniques and concerns about damage to the cloth. By the 1980s, the development of accelerator mass spectrometry allowed dating of milligram-sized samples rather than gram-sized ones, making testing more feasible with minimal damage. Negotiations between the Vatican, the shroud's custodians, and the scientific community proceeded through the mid-1980s, involving considerable bureaucratic complexity. The original plan called for 7 laboratories and a rigorous blind protocol with multiple control samples. By the time testing actually occurred, this had been reduced to 3 laboratories: Oxford, Arizona, and Zurich, and the protocol had been simplified in ways that some researchers subsequently criticized. The sampling itself took place on April 21, 1988. Luigi Ganella, scientific advisor to Cardinal Ballestraro, and the British Museum's Michael Tite, supervised the cutting of a strip from the shroud's corner, the raised corner, so called because it was the same area from which a small thread sample had been taken by the Belgian textile expert Gilbert Reyes in 1973 for a preliminary weave analysis. The strip was divided into samples for the 3 laboratories, along with control samples, including an ancient Egyptian linen of known age from the tomb of Cleopatra dating to around 100 BCE, and a Coptic linen of known medieval date. All samples were coded and the laboratories worked blind. The analysis took several months. The results were unambiguous in their consistency. Oxford reported 1200 to 1390 CE, Arizona 1304 to 1389 CE, Zurich 1275 to 1390 CE. The combined calibrated date range reported at the 95% confidence level was 1260 to 1390 CE. The paper reporting these results, published in the journal Nature in February 1989 under the authorship of P.E. Damon and multiple colleagues, stated plainly that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval. The date range placed the cloth's manufacture squarely in the period when it first appeared in historical documentation, the second half of the 14th century. The response to this announcement varied enormously. Many scientists and scholars accepted the result as conclusive. Carbon dating, properly conducted, does not lie. The cloth was medieval. The case was closed. Many Catholics, following the Vatican's lead, accepted the result with equanimity, noting that the Church had never officially proclaimed the shroud's authenticity and that its spiritual value was independent of its physical origin. A smaller but vocal group of researchers refused to accept the result and began systematically examining the conditions under which it had been obtained. The reweaving hypothesis, the most technically serious challenge to the 1988 result, deserves careful attention because it has attracted legitimate scientific engagement. The original proposal came from Leoncio Garza Valdez, a microbiologist at the University of Texas at San Antonio, who in the early 1990s reported finding a bioplastic film of bacterial origin coating the surface of shroud fibers. He argued that this biological contamination could have enriched the carbon-14 content of the cloth enough to skew the date. This specific version of the contamination hypothesis was subsequently challenged on quantitative grounds. The mass of contaminating material required to shift a first-century date to the 14th century would need to represent approximately 60% of the total mass of the sample, which would be visually obvious. The shroud's fibers show no such accumulation. The more refined version of the challenge came from Joseph Marino and M. Sue Benford, two American shroud researchers who in 2000 proposed that the sampling corner of the shroud had been repaired in the medieval period using invisible reweaving, the insertion of new threads of different age into the weave of the original cloth, with the repair disguised by dyeing the new threads to match the original. If the sampled corner contained a significant proportion of 14th century threads rewoven into an ancient cloth, the resulting date would represent a mixture of two ages and would be skewed toward the younger date. Marino and Benford published this hypothesis and attracted the attention of Raymond Rogers. Rogers was a physical chemist at Los Alamos National Laboratory who had been one of the most respected members of the original strip team. His investigation of the reweaving hypothesis, published in 2005 in Thermochemica Acta, was methodologically careful and attracted considerable attention precisely because of Rogers' credentials. Rogers reported examining threads from the raised corner. He had retained samples from the 1973 examination and found that these threads contained cotton fibers, madder root dye, rubia tinctorum, used in medieval textile dyeing, and a coating consistent with gum arabic, which was used in medieval textile finishing. None of these material was present in threads from the main body of the shroud, which Rogers had also retained. He concluded that the corner sample represented a medieval repair, and that the main body of the cloth was significantly older, consistent with a first-century origin. He also independently dated the main body cloth using vanillin content. Vanillin is a decomposition product of lignin in linen fibers that disappears over centuries. and found an absence of vanillin consistent with an age of at least 1,300 years, possibly much older. Rogers' paper was peer-reviewed and published in a legitimate scientific journal. It has not been definitively refuted, though it has been challenged. Those who examined the sample area in 1988, including multiple textile experts, uniformly reported finding no visible or microscopic evidence of reweaving. The weave pattern in the sample area was consistent with the rest of the cloth in all optical examinations. Rogers' chemical evidence was real but indirect. The presence of cotton, madder, and gum arabic could indicate repair, or it could indicate localized handling with different materials at some point in the cloth's history without full reweaving. The argument remains unresolved. The statistical challenge presented in 2019 by Kristen Casabianca and colleagues in the journal Archemetry took a different approach. Casabianca's team obtained the raw data from the 1988 testing through a Freedom of Information process and subjected it to fresh statistical analysis. They found that the measurements within each laboratory showed greater variation than would be expected from a homogeneous sample. That is, the different subsample cuts from the original strip gave dates that were inconsistent with each other at a level that should not occur if the strips were of uniform age. This heterogeneity, Casabianca argued, indicated that the sample was not homogeneous, consistent with the reweaving hypothesis, or with some other source of heterogeneity in the sample material. The statistical argument has merit. The 1988 paper's treatment of the data has been criticized by a statistician for combining the laboratory results in a way that obscure internal variation. What this does not tell us, as Casabianca's team acknowledged, is what the correct date would be if a new properly controlled test were conducted. The carbon dating controversy has effectively created a situation in which the most scientifically conclusive result in the Shroud's history is regarded by a significant portion of the research community as potentially unreliable, but no replacement test has been authorized. The Vatican has consistently declined to permit further sampling of the cloth, citing conservation concerns. The stalemate continues. Chapter 9. The image formation problem. Whatever the correct date of the shroud's cloth, the question of how its image was formed remains the most scientifically compelling aspect of the entire debate. This problem does not dissolve if the cloth is medieval. A forger who produced the shroud image in the 14th century used a technique that cannot be replicated by modern science. An authentic first-century burial cloth formed its image by a mechanism that has no known analog. Either way, the image formation problem is real and unresolved, and it has occupied more scientific attention than any other aspect of the shroud. The properties of the shroud image that any formation theory must account for are numerous and demanding. The image exists only in the topmost layer of the outermost fibril of the linen thread, at a depth of approximately 200 nanometers, which is the thickness of a few hundred atoms. It has no directionality. Examination under microscope from any angle reveals no brushstroke direction, no application vector, no orientation preference. It showed no evidence of capillary action. If any liquid medium had been applied to the cloth, the surface tension of the liquid would cause it to wick along the threads by capillary action, producing a characteristic spreading pattern. No pattern is present. The image grades smoothly from its maximum intensity to invisibility with no hard edges, a gradient that is very difficult to achieve by any contact or printing method. The image is a negative. It appears to encode three-dimensional distance information. And as Italian researchers discovered in 2004, it is present on both the front and back surfaces of the cloth, but not in the middle, a feature called double superficiality that is extraordinarily difficult to explain by any method that involves applying a substance to the cloth's surface. The vapograph hypothesis, sometimes called the Maillard reaction hypothesis, was developed most thoroughly by the chemist Giles Carter and later by Alan Adler. The idea is that the image was formed by a chemical reaction between amines volatilizing from a decomposing body in the carbohydrate coating on the linen fibers. The Maillard reaction is the same chemistry responsible for the browning of bread, the searing of meat, and the caramelization of sugar, a reaction between amino compounds and reducing sugars that produce yellow-brown compounds called melanoidins. If a body wrapped in linen were decomposing, the amines released from decomposing proteins could theoretically react with the carbohydrate coating of the fibers to produce a faint image. The negative character of the image could be explained by the inverse relationship between gas concentration and distance from the body. Areas of the cloth closest to the body surface receive more amine vapor and produce a darker image. Areas farther away receive less vapor and produce a lighter or no image. The problem with the vapograph hypothesis are fundamental. Gas diffuses in all directions, not just perpendicular to the body's surface. Any amine vapor produced by a decomposing body will diffuse sideways as well as upward, producing a progressively blurred and distorted image the longer the cloth remained in contact with the source. The extraordinarily sharp anatomical detail of the shroud image, sufficiently sharp for detailed forensic analysis, for identification of individual wound marks, for recognition of facial features, is incompatible with simple gas diffusion. Experimental attempts to produce shroud-like images using vapor from decomposing organic material have produced blurred, featureless stains rather than precise anatomical images. The corona discharge hypothesis was proposed by physicist Oswald Schurman and developed by others. This theory holds that the image was produced by a corona discharge, the kind of electrical glow discharge that occurs when a high-voltage electric field ionizes air, similar to the effect seen around high-tension power lines or during thunderstorms. A corona discharge directed from a three-dimensional body toward a flat cloth could theoretically produce a surface-only image that encoded distance information in its intensity. Experimental work with corona discharge on linen has produced some shroud-like surface effects, but the energy levels and conditions required to produce a full-body image are difficult to achieve and leave other detectable marks on the cloth that are not observed on the shroud. The radiation hypothesis has been the most extensively developed and the most theologically charged of the formation theories. The most prominent version, associated with John Jackson, who remained active in shroud research for decades after Stirp, proposes that the shroud was formed by a burst of radiant energy emanating from the body within. Jackson's model is physically specific. He proposed that the body dematerialized, becoming transparent, in that the cloth collapsed inward through the vacated space, receiving a radiation imprint as it fell. This model accounts for the front-back configuration of the image, the lack of distortion in the image, which cloth-body contact theories tend to produce, and the three-dimensional encoding. The Italian National Energy Agency, ENEA, conducted experiments in the 2000s using excimer's ultraviolet lasers to attempt to replicate shroud-like image properties on linen. They found that very short, very intense pulses of UV radiation could produce surface-only yellowing of linen fibers with some shroud-like properties. They calculated that to produce the entire shroud image would require an ultraviolet light intensity equivalent to several nuclear bombs concentrated in a single flash. The ENEA researchers were careful not to invoke the supernatural, but the implication was obvious. No known natural process, and certainly no medieval technology, could produce such a burst. The artistic hypotheses have been substantially more varied and inventive than the simple "someone painted it" thesis that Macron championed. Nicholas Allen, a South African art historian, proposed in the 1990s a proto-photographic theory. He argued that the shroud was produced by coating linen with a light-sensitive silver salt solution, stretching it as a screen inside a large darkened room or tent functioning as a camera obscura, and projecting onto it the image of a corpse or life-size figure placed outside in direct sunlight through a lens. The silver salt would darken in proportion to the light received, producing a negative image, which when washed to fix the image and naturally yellowed by aging, might resemble the shroud's appearance. Allen demonstrated experimentally that something like this was possible. His experiment produced a negative image on linen. However, the resulting image had different spectral properties from the shroud's image. The silver salts leave detectable residue, not found on the shroud, and the entire hypothesis requires postulating proto-photographic knowledge in medieval Europe, of which we have absolutely no other evidence. Luigi Garlascelli's 2009 experiment is the most technically detailed artistic replication attempted. Garlascelli, a professor of chemistry at the University of Pavia, used a full-size bas-relief sculpture of a human body, covered it with linen moistened with an acidic solution, and rubbed the cloth surface with a powder of iron oxide mixed with a small amount of acid. He then placed the cloth in an oven at temperatures consistent with medieval bread ovens, washed it, and aged it. The resulting cloth showed an image with several shroud-like properties. It was a negative, it was superficial in character, and it had the general contours of a human body. Garlascelli's experiment received enormous press attention as proof of medieval forgery. Shroud researchers who examined his results pointed out, however, that his image lacked the specific properties most difficult to explain, the three-dimensional encoding. His image did not produce a coherent VP8 output. The double superficiality. His image did not appear on the back of the cloth. In the absence of any detectable medium in the image fibers, his image areas showed the expected acidic residue. The double superficiality discovery made by Giulio Fanti and Roberto Maggiolo of the University of Padua in 2004 deserves special emphasis because it places particularly severe constraints on formation theories. Fanti and Maggiolo analyzed images of the back surface of the shroud taken during the 2002 conservation project. when the backing cloth was removed and the underside was photographed and digitally processed for the first time. They found a faint image on the back surface of the cloth that corresponded in its general outlines to the face image on the front. This back surface image was even fainter than the front surface image and showed slightly different characteristics, but it was real, confirmed by multiple independent image processing approaches. Crucially, analysis of threads from the cloth showed that this back surface image, like the front surface image, was confined to the outermost fibril of the threads. The middle of the cloth showed no image at all. For any theory involving a substance applied to the front surface, a mechanism would be needed to simultaneously produce a matching image on the back surface without the substance penetrating through to the back, which would normally be prevented by the body of the thread lying between the two surfaces. For a radiation-based theory emanating from within the body, the double superficiality is easier to account for. Radiation intense enough to affect the front surface might also affect the back surface while leaving the interior of the threads shielded. Chapter 10. Blood, pollen, DNA, and the details. Beyond the central question of image formation and carbon dating, Shroud research has generated an enormous body of detailed physical and chemical evidence that collectively contributes to our understanding of what the cloth is and where it might have been. This chapter surveys the most significant of these subsidiary lines of evidence. The blood evidence begins with the fundamental question of whether the dark red-brown stains on the shroud are in fact blood. This question, which sounds elementary, turns out to be scientifically subtle. Many organic substances produce stains that resemble blood. Pigments can be formulated to mimic blood's color. The definitive identification of blood requires chemical analysis. STIRP researchers, particularly Heller and Adler, conducted a battery of tests on the fibers from the blood-stained areas and from the non-blood-stained image areas, comparing the results. Their tests included tests for porphyrin, the core ring structure of the hemoglobin, for albumin, a blood serum protein, for bilirubin, a biopigment elevated in trauma, for immunoglobulins, antibody proteins found in blood serum, and for the specific spectroscopic signature of hemoglobin in its breakdown products. All these tests returned positive results from the blood-stained areas. The blood spectroscopic signature was consistent with aged human blood that had been through a degradation process similar to what is expected over centuries. The blood type was identified by multiple groups as type AB, a blood type present in approximately 3 to 4% of the general population, but in somewhat higher frequency in Middle Eastern populations. AB is also the blood type most commonly found in the Sudarium of Oviedo, a cloth we will discuss in detail later. However, blood typing of ancient material is technically unreliable because degradation, dehydration, and contamination can alter the antigens responsible for blood type. Most forensic scientists treat the blood type identification of the shroud as interesting, but not definitive. The elevated bilirubin finding by Adler has been among the most medically specific claims in shroud research. Bilirubin is a yellow bile pigment produced by the breakdown of hemoglobin from red blood cells. Normally present in blood in small quantities, bilirubin rises sharply in the blood when red blood cells are being destroyed at an elevated rate. as occurs in severe physical trauma, in acute anemia, and in conditions that cause hemolysis, the rupturing of red blood cells. Adler proposed that the levels of bilirubin in the shroud bloodstains were consistent with a person who had undergone extensive physical trauma, severe beatings, prolonged stress, extreme blood loss, before death. While this is a specific and interesting finding, critics have noted that the interpretation of bilirubin levels in ancient dried blood is difficult, and that contamination with various organic materials could produce similar spectroscopic signals. In 1994, a team led by Victor Tryon at the University of Texas Health Science Center attempted to amplify human DNA from the shroud's bloodstains using the polymerase chain reaction (PCR) technique, which had by then become standard in forensic genetics. Tryon's team successfully amplified DNA, confirming the presence of human genetic material in the bloodstains, but found that the DNA was extremely fragmented and degraded, as would be expected from ancient material exposed to centuries of temperature variation and handling. They also found evidence of DNA from multiple individuals, which is consistent either with contamination from many people who have handled the cloth or with actual blood from multiple sources on the cloth. Tryon was careful not to overinterpret the result. He noted that contamination was the most likely explanation for the multiple individual findings. In 2015, a team led by Gianni Barcaccia at the University of Padua published a more ambitious DNA study using high-throughput sequencing to identify a broader range of DNA present on the shroud. They found human mitochondrial DNA haplotypes from multiple geographic lineage, including European, Middle Eastern, North African, and East Asian populations, a distribution consistent with the cloth's documented history of global handling and exhibition. More specifically, they found plant DNA from a range of species, including some characteristic of the Middle East and the Levant region. The plant DNA consistent with the Levant included species whose pollen had previously been identified by Max Frey-Sulzer. The global distribution of human DNA, Barcaccia's team noted, made it essentially impossible to draw geographic conclusions from the human genetic material, but the consistent identification of Middle Eastern plant species was suggestive. Max Frey-Sulzer's pollen work, conducted in 1973 and 1978 using sticky tape samples, remains one of the most discussed and contested lines of evidence in shroud research. Frey-Sulzer was a Swiss forensic criminologist of considerable reputation. He had worked on numerous significant cases, including the examination of the Mussolini diaries. He was also, it must be noted, a man whose professional legacy has been complicated by later revelations. His authentication of the forged Hitler diaries in 1983, shortly before his death, demonstrated that his judgment could be seriously wrong on questions of documentary authenticity. This does not necessarily invalidate his pollen analysis, but it should be held in mind. Frey-Sulzer reported identifying 58 different plant species in pollen form on the shroud surface, of which he said that 45 species were not found in Europe. They were species characteristic of Palestine, Anatolia, and region around Constantinople. Some were specifically adapted to the arid environment around the Dead Sea. Zygophyllum demosum, a desert plant whose distribution barely extends into southern Turkey and which grows primarily in Israel, Jordan, and the Sinai. If such pollen is genuinely present on Shroud in abundance, it suggests strongly that the cloth spent significant time in the Middle East, consistent with a Palestinian origin, or at least with the proposed Edessa-Constantinople itinerary. The challenge is that Fry Sulzer died in 1983, before his full data could be published. The subsequent examination of his preserved slides by other palynologists has found some of his identifications questionable. The Stirp examination found fewer pollen grains than Fry Sulzer had reported. The pollen evidence is tantalizing, but not conclusive. The coins on the eye hypothesis represents one of the most specific and most contested claims in shroud research. The idea was proposed originally by Francis Felice, a Jesuit theologian, based on his examination of high-resolution photographs of the shroud face. Felice believed he could discern an area of the right eyelid, the imprint of a specific coin, a lepton, a Pontius Pilate, a bronze coin minted during the Roman prefecture of Judea between 26 and 36 CE, bearing a representation of an augur staff called a lituus. Placing coins on the eyes of the dead was a burial practice attested in the ancient Greco-Roman world, though less common in Jewish burial. If genuine, the imprint of a coin minted during Pilate's prefecture would establish an absolutely specific terminus post quem. The cloth could not be earlier than Pilate's period. Subsequent researchers, including Michael Marks and others, argued they could discern additional details of the coin's markings in image-enhanced photographs. However, the main body of shroud researchers, including those sympathetic to the cloth's authenticity, have found these coin identifications unpersuasive. The features identified as coins and coin inscriptions are at the very limits of resolution in the photographic images, and may well be artifacts of image processing. Most researchers treat this hypothesis with considerable skepticism. The soil analysis work by Kolbeck and Natowski in the mid-1980s found travertine aragonite, a calcium carbonate mineral with specific crystalline structure, in samples from the foot area of the shroud image. They compared this material with samples from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and found a mineralogical match. European limestone is typically calcite rather than aragonite, and the specific crystalline structure of the Jerusalem sample was distinctive enough that Kolbeck and Natowski argued the shroud could not have originated in Europe. The findings has been contested by those who argue that the samples were too small for reliable mineralogical conclusions, and that the matching could be coincidental or the result of deliberate salting with Jerusalem soil. It remains an intriguing but inconclusive data point. Chapter 11. The Sudarium of Oviedo and the question of corroborating relics. The Shroud of Turin is not the only relic that has been proposed as physical evidence relating to the burial of Jesus. The most important corroborating relic, the one that has attracted the most serious academic attention alongside the shroud, is the Sudarium of Oviedo, housed in the Camera Santa of the Cathedral of San Salvador in the city of Oviedo in northern Spain. The Sudarium, whose name derived from the Latin word for sweat cloth, is a small, roughly 21 by 34-inch piece of bloodstained linen. Unlike the shroud, it bears no human image. What it bears instead is a complex pattern of bloodstains and fluid stains distributed across its surface in a manner that researchers have argued is consistent with it having been wrapped around a human head that was bleeding from wounds. The stains include areas consistent with postmortem blood flow from the nose and mouth, the kind of bloody fluid that can emerge from respiratory passages after death, and what appear to be puncture wounds consistent with a crown of thorns. The sudarium's documented history is actually longer than the shroud's, and this is one of the reasons it attracts interest. The cloth is attested in church records going back at least to the 7th century. A chronicle from around 570 CE describes a reliquary containing what was identified as the face cloth of Jesus being present in Jerusalem. In 616 CE, as the Sassanid Persian Empire invaded Palestine and threatened Jerusalem, the reliquary was reportedly taken for safekeeping, traveling first to Alexandria, then to Cartagena in Spain, and eventually to Toledo, the Visigothic capital. When Toledo was threatened by the Moorish invasion in the early 8th century, the reliquary was again moved north, ultimately reaching Oviedo around 840 CE, where it was deposited in the treasury of the cathedral built by King Alfonso II. It has been there ever since. Darium's documentation, traceable with some confidence from the 7th century forward, is in marked contrast to the shroud's apparent absence from the record before the 1350s. If both cloth are genuine, this difference in documentary survival is puzzling. One explanation proposed by researchers is that the sudarium as a face cloth with no human image was always treated as a secondary relic and passed through the hands of private custodians rather than major institutions, which meant its history was more easily preserved in straightforward documentary form. The shroud, if it is the Mandylion and had a far more complex institutional history involving Byzantine court, crusader looting, and powerful political interests, a history that created both more documentation and more gaps. The scientific comparison between the sudarium and the shroud has been conducted by a team of Spanish researchers. The most detailed analysis was carried out by Jaime Izquierdo Berlanga and colleagues, with bloodstain pattern work done by Ana Mercy Villain Blanco. Their findings, if accepted, are remarkable. The bloodstain patterns on the sudarium, interpreted as coming from a wounded head wrapped in the cloth at two different orientations, consistent with the body being repositioned between removal from the cross and placement in the tomb, match the positions and dimensions of the blood and wound marks on the shroud's head region with a precision that the researchers argue is too specific to be coincidental. The overall shape of the stain pattern is consistent with the same head geometry, the same nose position, the same distribution of wounds around the scalp, the same post-mortem blood flow patterns. The blood type identified on the sudarium is also AB, matching the shroud, and the specific pattern of folding impressions visible on the sudarium is consistent with it having been wrapped around a head and the precise orientation needed to match the shroud's wound pattern. The Spanish team also noted that pollen species identified on the sudarium included Quercus calaprinos, the Palestine oak, and other Middle Eastern species also found in Fry-Sulzer's shroud pollen analysis. The convergence of evidence between the two cloths
is for researchers sympathetic to their authenticity among the most compelling arguments in the case. Two separate cloths in two separate locations with two separate documentary histories showing convergence, physical evidence pointing toward the same individual and the same geographic origin. Skeptics argue that the Spanish team's bloodstain matching involves too many assumptions about the body's position in the cloth's orientation, and that the matching is not as precise as claimed. They also note that blood type AB is not uniquely Middle Eastern, and that the pollen overlaps could reflect contamination pathways rather than geographic origin. The Sudarium has not yet been carbon dated with the same thoroughness as the Shroud, though a partial analysis reportedly placed it in the first millennium CE, consistent with its claimed history. Chapter 12. The Templar Theory, the Da Vinci Theory, in the Landscape of Forgery. The question of the Shroud's hidden centuries, the gap between its claimed 1st century origin and its documented 14th century emergence, has generated a rich literature of historical speculation. Some of this speculation is careful and historically grounded. Some of it strays into the territory of conspiracy theory. A thorough account of the Shroud requires engaging honestly with both, because even the more adventurous theories sometimes rests on real historical evidence. The Knights Templar theory deserves a careful consideration. The Knights Templar were founded at the Council of Troyes in 1129. Troyes, significantly being the city of the bishops who objected to the Shroud in the 14th century. The primary base of the operation was Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which they used as their headquarters and which gave the order its name. They had privileged access to Jerusalem and its surroundings throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, and they maintained extensive contact with the Byzantine court, trading partners, occasional military allies, and co-participants in the complicated politics of the Crusader states. The suggestion that the Templars might have acquired the Mandilion or the Shroud from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade has historical plausibility. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was one of the greatest acts of cultural looting in medieval history, scattering the Byzantine imperial collections, including the extraordinary relic collection of the Pharaoh's Chapel, across the Crusader-controlled world. Templar agents were active in Constantinople before and during the sack, and the order had the resources and the motivation to acquire sacred objects of great value. If they obtained the Mandilion, the folded shroud, and brought it to their European properties, it would explain how the relic reached France and why it was never publicly displayed. The Templars were a secretive order that would not have casually exhibited a treasure of this magnitude. The arrest of the Templars in 1307 is where the story becomes most specific and most intriguing. The confessions extracted from Templar knights under torture described, among other things, the veneration of an idol called Baphomet. The description of Baphomet in the trial records are varied and inconsistent. Some say it was a wooden or metal head. Some say it was a skull. Some say it was a bearded face on a cloth. The variability of these descriptions has led most historians to conclude that Baphomet was a composite fantasy created by the combination of torture, confused testimony, and inquisitors primed to find heresy. But Ian Wilson and others have argued that the bearded face on a cloth description could reflect an actual object, the folded shroud, showing only the face, that the Templars were venerating as a sacred icon, a practice that would seem inexplicably heretical to an inquisitor who did not understand the object's identity. The Geoffrey de Charny connection is the most concrete element of the theory. The preceptor of Normandy for the Knights Templar, a senior official of the order, was named Geoffrey de Charny, the same surname as the man who first publicly exhibited the shroud in Loret. Geoffrey de Charny was burned at the stake in Paris on March 18, 1314, alongside Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, after both men dramatically recanted their confessions and proclaimed the order innocent at the moment of their execution. The two men burned on an island in the Seine, and contemporary accounts describe their deaths as extraordinarily composed and dignified. If the later Geoffrey de Charny of Loret was a nephew or kinsman of the executed Templar preceptor, then a line of inheritance for the shroud from Templar custody to private French noble hands becomes at least imaginable. Genealogical research has not definitively established a family connection, but the name identity is real and unexplained. The Leonardo da Vinci hypothesis is of a completely different character and origin, and it is, on close examination, far less convincing. The theory, associated primarily with the American scholar Lynn Prignett and Clive Prince, and elaborated by others, proposes that the shroud is not a medieval forgery at all, but a Renaissance forgery, specifically a proto-photographic image created by Leonardo da Vinci using silver salts in a camera obscura sometime around 1492. The hypothesis has the advantage of explaining the remarkable quality of the shroud image by invoking a genius of the first order, someone who actually understood optics, chemistry, and anatomy in ways that most medieval artists did not. The problems with the Da Vinci hypothesis are fundamental, however. The most basic is chronological. The shroud was in the custody of the House of Savoy and being publicly exhibited at least 40 years before Leonardo is recorded as being associated with the Savoy court at any point. The Loret badge, securely dated to the mid-14th century, shows an image of the shroud that matches its current appearance. Leonardo was born in 1452. A Da Vinci forgery would require either that the historical record of the shroud's earlier displays is fabricated, which would require a conspiracy of enormous scope, or that Leonardo somehow modified an existing cloth, which introduced more problems than it solves. Additionally, some versions of the theory propose that the shroud image is a self-portrait of Leonardo, a claim that rests on a subjective comparison of the shroud face with Leonardo's later self-portraits, which is not a sound basis for any historical argument. The Da Vinci hypothesis is best understood as a creative alternative to the dull medieval painter theory, but it does not hold up to scrutiny. The broader landscape of forgery theories, from the simple medieval painter thesis to the proto-photographic proposals, all confront the same fundamental problem: the image's physical properties, as documented by Stirp and subsequent researchers, are not consistent with any known artistic technique, medieval or Renaissance. This does not prove authenticity. It means that if the shroud is a forgery, the forger used a method we cannot identify. The mystery of the shroud is, in this sense, as much a mystery about a potential forgery as about a potential relic. Chapter 13. Modern Controversies. The shroud debate has not stood still in the 21st century. New analytical techniques, new researchers, and new controversies have continued to emerge, each adding fresh complexity to an already intricate picture. This chapter surveys the most significant modern developments. The bloodstain pattern analysis debate took a significant new turn in 2018, when Mattia Barini of Liverpool, John Moores University, and Luigi Garlascelli, the same Garlascelli who had produced the experimental replica a decade earlier, published a paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences analyzing the bloodstain patterns on the shroud's wrist and forearm areas, using actual human blood in a model of human anatomy. They tested whether the flow patterns of the blood on the shroud were consistent with the positions a crucified body would have assumed on the cross. Their conclusion was that the bloodstain patterns on the forearms were not consistent with a single body position, but appeared to require the body to have been in multiple physiological incompatible positions simultaneously, suggesting the blood was not deposited by gravity-driven flow from wounds on a living or recently dead body in a fixed position, but by some other process, possibly deliberate application. This would support the forgery hypothesis. The response from Shroud researchers was vigorous. Supporters of authenticity argued that Barini and Garlascelli's model made simplifying assumptions about the body position during crucifixion that were not supported by the historical or archaeological evidence. The angle of the arms, the degree of sagging, the rotation of the wrists, all of these variables affect the blood flow direction, and none of them can be specified with precision from the historical record. Furthermore, bloodstain pattern analysis as a forensic discipline has been the subject of significant scrutiny in recent years regarding its evidentiary reliability in general. The blood flow directions on the shroud, in the view of its defenders, are consistent with the body that changed positions between the cross, removal, carrying, and being laid flat, which is exactly what the Gospel accounts describe. The debate has not been resolved, but it has added another layer of complexity to the forensic picture. Giulio Fonti of the University of Padua has been among the most productive shroud researchers of the past 2 decades. In addition to the double superficiality work in the 2013 dating experiment, Fonti has published studies on the 3-dimensional properties of the shroud image, on the character of the blood in serum stains, and on the mechanical properties of the linen fibers. His 2013 dating results, produced from 3 independent techniques applied to threads he claimed were from the shroud, gave combined date of approximately 33 BCE plus or minus 250 years, consistent with a first-century origin. This result was published in a book, El Mistero della Sindone, rather than a peer-reviewed journal, which has limited its acceptance in the scientific community. The Turin authorities also disputed that Fonti's samples were authentic shroud material. The 2010 high-definition digital photography project, funded by the Archdiocese of Turin, produced the most detailed photographic record of the shroud ever made. Billions of pixels of data, revealing features invisible in earlier photography. This dataset has been made available to researchers worldwide and has generated a new wave of image analysis studies. Researchers have used it to revisit the bloodstain patterns, to examine the weave structure in fine detail, to look for additional forensic information in the wound marks, and to try to characterize the image properties with greater precision. The dataset has not produced a consensus, but it has provided a common empirical foundation for ongoing research. One notable study using the high-definition data was conducted by Paolo Di Lazzaro, and colleagues at ENEA, Italy's National Energy Agency, and published in 2012. De Lazzaro's team performed extensive UV laser experiment on linen samples to characterize what conditions could produce surface-only discoloration with shroud-like spectral properties. They found that pulses of deep UV light lasting less than 50 nanoseconds, 50 billionth of a second, could produce yellowing confined to the surface fibril without penetrating the fiber interior. Their calculations showed that to produce the entire shroud image by this mechanism would require UV light of an intensity roughly 100 billion times greater than that produced by any known UV source, including the most powerful lasers then in existence. De Lazzaro was explicit that he was not claiming the resurrection produced the image. He was noting that no known human or natural process could produce the required UV flux. The Vatican's management of access to the shroud has been a consistent source of frustration for researchers on all sides. Since the transfer of custody from the Savoy family in 1983, all requests for scientific examination, sampling, and testing must pass through the Vatican Secretariat of State and the Office of the Archbishop of Turin. The pace of approval is slow, and the criteria for approval are not publicly stated. Numerous proposals for new radiocarbon dating, which would require cutting a few milligrams of cloth from several locations, causing negligible visible damage, have been submitted and declined. The Vatican's stated position is that the conservation of the cloth takes priority over scientific testing, and that the spiritual value of the shroud is independent of its physical origin. This position is coherent, but it leaves the scientific questions permanently open, which is itself a kind of answer. The 2015 public exposition was the most recent, drawing approximately 2 million visitors to Turin over several weeks. In addition to the in-person display, the exposition was the occasion for a detailed online presentation and for renewed discussion of the scientific questions. Pope Francis's visit during the exposition was widely noted for his careful language. He called the shroud an image of love and a mirror of the gospel, descriptions that affirm its spiritual significance, while carefully declining to affirm its physical authenticity. This has been the consistent approach of the papacy since at least the 1980s, acknowledging the shroud's importance while avoiding the kind of definitive statement that would commit the Church to a position that science might later undermine. The popular culture footprint of the shroud has grown enormously in the internet age. Documentaries, YouTube videos, and podcasts have made the shroud story accessible to audiences who never read a peer-reviewed paper. This popularization has its benefits. It has brought a genuine scientific puzzles to a wide audience, but also its hazards, including the circulation of both credulous speculation and dismissive oversimplification. Books claiming to solve the shroud mystery appear regularly in both the authenticity and the forgery camps. The actual state of the evidence, with its genuine complexity and genuine uncertainty, tends to get lost between these confident poles. Chapter 14. The Theological Dimension. Throughout this long account of scientific testing, historical research, and forensic analysis, we have been orbiting a question that science cannot answer. What does the shroud mean? How should believing Christians engage with an object whose authenticity remains scientifically uncertain? And what does the entire debate reveal about the relationship between faith and evidence? For believers in the shroud's authenticity, particularly within Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, the stakes of the question are immense. If the shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, then it is a physical trace of the most significant event in human history, the event that in Christian theology accomplished the reconciliation of humanity with God, conquered death, and opened the possibility of eternal life. The wounds visible on the shroud would be the wounds of the Passion, not symbols or representations, but the actual marks left by actual violence on the actual body of God's incarnate. The face in the negative photograph would be, as close as any image can come, the face of Jesus. This is not a small claim. For a devout Christian, the possibility that such an object exists, that God left a physical trace, that the resurrection left a record, is not merely intellectually interesting, it is personally transforming. The theological tradition of relic veneration that we examined earlier provides the framework within which the shroud's devotional significance is understood. In Catholic theology, relics are not magical objects. They do not work independently of faith or prayer. Their significance lies in their witness to the reality of the incarnation and to the sanctity of material existence. A genuine burial cloth of Jesus would witness, in the most direct possible way, to the fact that Jesus was a real historical person who died a real historical death, in whose body, whatever happened to it afterward, left a real physical mark on the world. For Christians who live in a culture that increasingly questions the historical reliability of the gospel accounts, the shroud's forensic specificity is compelling. Here is a cloth whose wounds match the gospels with a precision that no medieval artist could have known to achieve. The Roman Catholic Church's official position has evolved subtly over the decades. Pope John Paul II, who venerated the shroud twice, described it as, quote, a silent witness but also a surprisingly eloquent one, unquote. His language carefully stopped short of pronouncing it authentic, while leaving no doubt about his personal sense of its significance. Pope Benedict XVI, during his 2010 visit, described it as, quote, an icon written in blood, the blood of a man who was scourged, crowned with thorns, crucified, and had his right side pierced, unquote. Benedict's use of the word icon is theologically precise. In Eastern Christian tradition, an icon is not merely a representation, but a participation in the reality it depicts. By calling the shroud an icon, Benedict was affirming its spiritual reality while leaving open the question of its physical origin. Pope Francis, in 2013, and again during his 2015 visit, has used similarly careful language, calling it an image of love and noting that it calls us to go to the center, which is the suffering of Jesus and what it means for our lives. None of these statements constitutes a formal dogmatic pronouncement. The Church has been remarkably consistent in refusing to make such a pronouncement in either direction. The theologian Hans Ur von Balthasar, one of the most influential Catholic thinkers of the 20th century, wrote about the shroud in terms that illuminate the deeper theological issue. Von Balthasar argued that the desire for physical proof of the resurrection, the desire to have the shroud be definitively authentic, is itself a form of the doubt it seeks to overcome. Faith that depends on physical evidence is not, in the strict theological sense, faith. The shroud, on this view, is most theologically valuable precisely in its ambiguity. It is offered to us as a possible trace, inviting contemplation, inviting devotion, but not compelling belief. It is consistent with the pattern of the gospel themselves, in which the resurrection is presented as an event that leaves witnesses uncertain, that requires interpretation, that demands a response of faith rather than a passive reception of proof. For skeptics, the theological framing is itself part of the problem. The careful agnosticism of the Vatican, affirming the shroud's devotional value while declining to pronounce its authenticity, can be read not as theological nuance, but as institutional protection, refusing to commit to a claim that might be disproved while retaining the benefits of having the most venerated relic in Christianity in one's custody. The financial and cultural value of the Shroud to Turin, it brings millions of tourists and pilgrims to the city, is not a secret. The fact that scientific testing that might definitively resolve the question is perpetually deferred on conservation grounds is not lost on the skeptical observer. The broader philosophical question raised by the Shroud debate is one that extends beyond religion. How do we adjudicate between different types of evidence when they point in different directions? The Shroud presents a case in which scientific evidence, the carbon dating, and physical-chemical evidence, the image formation properties, genuinely conflict, not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because the scientific evidence may be compromised in specific documented ways, and the physical evidence points towards something genuinely anomalous that neither the authenticity hypothesis nor the forgery hypothesis fully explains. We are not left with a question that has been answered and then raised again by motivated reasoning, but with a question that has never been cleanly answered in the first place. This is uncomfortable for people on both sides of the debate. Those who believe the cloth is medieval want the 1988 carbon dating to be the end of the matter, and they find the continuing scientific challenges to be frustrating or disingenuous. Those who believe the cloth is genuine want the image formation mystery to be the end of the matter, and they find the skeptic's unwillingness to be moved by it frustrating or obtuse. Neither side gets the clarity they want, because the evidence genuinely does not provide it. The Shroud's deepest lesson may be about the limits of our ability to compel assent from others and from ourselves. Chapter 15. The State of the Question. We have now moved through the full sweep of the Shroud's history and science. It is worth pausing to take stock, to summarize what is established and what is contested, and what remains genuinely unknown. What is established beyond reasonable dispute? The Shroud is an ancient linen cloth of considerable age. It bears a faint double image of a man, front and back, whose wounds are consistent with Roman crucifixion. The image is not formed by any detectable applied medium. It is a discoloration of the surface fibers produced by some process that remains unexplained. The bloodstains on the cloth contains compounds consistent with human blood, including porphyrin, bilirubin, albumin, and other blood proteins, and they predate the image. The cloth bears physical evidence of a fire in 1532 and subsequent repair. It has been in Turin since 1578 and in the care of the Holy See since 1983. What is contested? The carbon dating result of 1260 to 1390 CE is the most significant scientific finding in the Shroud's history, but it has been challenged on material ground. The reweaving hypothesis, supported by Rogers' peer-reviewed 2005 paper. On statistical ground, the Casabianca et al. 2019 paper, and on contamination grounds, various proposals, none of which has been fully quantitatively validated. The blood type identification as AB is interesting, but not reliably determinative from ancient material. The pollen evidence from Max Frey-Sulzer is suggestive of Middle Eastern origin, but has not been fully verified or reproduced. The coin identifications are not accepted by most researchers. The VP8 three-dimensional encoding is a real and documented property of the image, whose mechanism is unknown. What remains genuinely unknown? The mechanism of image formation, the most scientifically interesting open question, has not been solved by any proposed theory, natural, artistic, or supernatural. No current proposed technique can simultaneously account for the surface-only deposition, the negative character, the three-dimensional encoding, the double superficiality, the absence of any detectable medium, and the anatomical precision of the image. The provenance of the cloth before the 1350s is unknown. The identity of the man whose image appears on it is unknown in the scientific sense, though the wound patterns are consistent with crucifixion. Whether the 1988 carbon dating result reflects the actual age of the main body of the cloth is uncertain. What would settle the question to the extent that anything could? New radiocarbon dating conducted on multiple samples from different areas of the main body of the cloth, far from the raised corner that was sampled in 1988, with rigorous modern controls and AMS technology capable of working from milligram samples. If multiple samples from separate areas of the cloth all returned consistent medieval dates, the reweaving hypothesis would effectively be eliminated, and the 1988 result would be confirmed. If the main body of the cloth dated to the 1st century while the corner remained medieval, the reweaving hypothesis would be affirmed, and the case for authenticity would be dramatically strengthened. This test has been proposed by researchers from both the authenticity and skeptic camps. It has not been authorized. Additional chemical characteristic of the image fibers using techniques developed since 1978, particularly mass spectrometry, capable of identifying specific molecular compounds at trace levels, might help resolve the image formation question by identifying exactly what chemical transformation occurred in the surface fibril. New forensic DNA analysis using techniques capable of distinguishing ancient from modern contamination and of typing ancient mitochondrial haplotypes might provide geographic information about the individual whose blood and skin cells are on the cloth. Neutron activation analysis of the limestone residuals might more definitively characterize their geographic origin. None of these tests have been authorized. The shroud sits in its chapel in Turin, in a case filled with argon gas, behind bulletproof glass, in a temperature and humidity controlled environment designed to prevent further deterioration. Its custodians are the Vatican, working through the Archbishop of Turin, and they have consistently concluded that the preservation of the cloth takes priority over further scientific investigation. This is a defensible position. It is also from the perspective of those who believe the question is still scientifically open, a position that perpetuates a state of indefinite uncertainty. Conclusion. We have come a long way tonight, from the herringbone weave of an ancient piece of linen, to the gardens of Gethsemane, to the Byzantine court of Constantinople, to a collegiate church in rural France, to Secondo Pia's darkroom to the 5 sleepless nights of the Sturp team in Turin, to the quiet devastation of a carbon dating result, and to the ongoing unresolved argument that has outlasted every attempt to end it. We have met Geoffrey de Charny, the celebrated knight whose silence about how he obtained the cloth has echoed for 7th centuries. We have met Pierre Darcy, the bishop who knew what he knew and found that even the Pope would not help him. We have met Helena, the emperor's mother who went to Jerusalem and came back with the true cross. We have met King Abgar of Edessa, who sent a letter to Jesus and received, if the legends are right, a cloth bearing his face in return. We have met Secondo Pia, standing alone in his dark room at midnight in 1898, holding a glass plate up to the light and seeing something that no human being had ever seen before. We have met Walter Macrone, a man of absolute scientific conviction, and Alan Adler and John Heller, who looked at the same samples and saw something different. We have met John Jackson, who fed a photograph into a machine designed to read the topology of stars and found a human face looking back at him in 3 dimensions. What we have not found is an answer. The shroud does not give answers. It gives a question, one that is simple to state and apparently impossible to resolve. Is this the cloth in which the body of Jesus of Nazareth was wrapped 2,000 years ago in a rock-cut tomb outside the walls of Jerusalem? The evidence, looked at with complete honesty, is genuinely ambiguous. The carbon dating says no, but the carbon dating has been credibly challenged and has not been repeated. The image formation says something happened that we cannot explain, but we cannot explain it does not mean it is miraculous. The medical and forensic detail is consistent with 1st century crucifixion victim, but it might reflect an extraordinarily well-informed medieval artist. The pollen in soil and mineralogical evidence points towards the Middle East, but none of it is conclusive. The historical trail before 1350 is suggestive but unproven. Neither the believers nor the skeptics have won this argument. Both sides have made good points, and both have overreached. The shroud has absorbed every attempt at definitive resolution and returned it complicated. It remains what it has always been, an object at the edge of knowability, a thing that asks more of us than we can easily give. The philosopher of science, Karl Popper, argued that genuine scientific questions are those that are in principle falsifiable, questions that could be answered no if the evidence went the other way. The shroud question by this standard is scientifically real. A new carbon dating result from multiple areas could definitively confirm or refute the medieval origin. A reproducible image formation technique could demonstrate that a forger with unknown skills was responsible. A falsifiable test could end the debate. What Popper also understood, however, is that even falsifiable questions can remain open for a very long time. When the object of the question is irreplaceable, the custodians are cautious, and the stakes, for those who believe, are nothing less than the physical trace of God in the world. The cloth will still be there tomorrow, resting in its argon-filled case, behind its glass, in the chapel that Guarini built for it in 1694. 14.5 feet long, slightly amber-colored, bearing on its surface the faintest visible impression of a man, whose wounds match those described in a 2,000-year-old text, an impression formed by a process no one has been able to identify, and a negative that waited 5 centuries to be seen. And perhaps the gift of the shroud is ambiguity itself. After every test, every tape sample, every carbon isotope, every laser pulse and statistical reanalysis, the shroud has refused to be closed. It has absorbed the full force of modern science and returned it unresolved. And maybe that is not a failure of the investigation. Maybe that is the point. We live in an age that believes deeply and almost religiously that every question has an answer if we apply enough rigor. That mystery is just ignorance waiting to be corrected. The shroud suggests otherwise. It suggests that some questions are structured at their core around a space that evidence cannot fill, a space that each person must fill for themselves, with whatever they bring to it, faith or doubt, or something quieter than either. The believers who stand before it and feel the presence of Christ are not being irrational. The skeptics who stand before it and see a remarkable medieval artifact are not being cold. Both are doing the only honest thing available to them, choosing, in the absence of certainty, what they will believe. That is not a consolation prize. That is what it means to be human. The shroud has been asking that of us for centuries, and it will go on asking long after we are gone. Rest in that. Tonight, good night and sleep well.